Selamat datang! Welcome everyone. Bienvenue, willkommen, 欢迎大家. My name is Xuanming, and together with Ilva, Neil, and Gustavo, my co-founders of IGNITX, a very warm welcome to yet another episode of IGNIT's What Is series, a part of our IGNIT's Knowledge campaign. A little shout out first to all fellow Singaporeans, Happy National Day! And for those of you who are new to IGNITX, allow me to give a brief introduction. IGNITX is a family of international events experts and enthusiasts with a passion and desire to make a positive difference in the world. We provide specialized consultancy and operational services in combination with active and integrated support of project delivery. IGNITX is a strong advocate of education, what with it being one of our pillars. And of course, a large part of education and growth is knowledge sharing. This is vital to continued innovation and revitalization of policies and processes. It allows evolution and it promotes multifaceted thinking, while also sparking curiosity and empowering those who would learn. We launched this What Is series to serve as a source of information to future and established events professionals alike. It has been a common experience for us over the years that it is not quite so easy to obtain specific information and knowledge of the industry on topics without getting practical experience working in events first, or perhaps attending a sport management course, or having a friend who works in the industry who can give you insights. Hence, our aim is to provide specific knowledge and information in a way that is open for all who are curious. Now, in this 5th episode of the What Is series, we are shifting our perspective from the planning and operational aspects of a sport event to that of its larger economic considerations. What are the impacts of sport events on the growth and development indicators of an economy? Why would a nation be interested in bidding for a major sport event? So to help us dive into this topic of what is the impact of economic growth and development, we have invited a special guest to share his educational insight and analysis on this matter. Ian Tay is an economic historian and graduate from the London School of Economics, University of Vienna, the National University of Malaysia, UKM, and Marquette. He is currently head of department at a private college in Cambridge. Ian was also an elite athlete himself in his younger years and is also an active volunteer at major sporting events during his semester breaks. He was a volunteer in the inaugural Summer and Winter Youth Olympic Games in Singapore and then in Innsbruck. He also tries to visit the host cities of major sporting events during the Games time as well. A global citizen, definitely, Ian loves traveling and learning about the cultures and history of the world. So let me just welcome Ian. Hi, Ian.
Thanks, Ming. It's great to be here today, but please allow me to clarify that I'm no expert in this topic, and besides a quick late night literature review of academic journals and official reports on this specific topic, I would admit that I still know very little on the intricacies of the sports economics arena. So unlike your other guests in your previous webinars, I'm in no way good enough to talk about such details of the ins and outs of the organization of sports events. However, what I think I'm qualified and experienced enough to share with all of you today is the framework that one can use when analyzing the impact of sports events or other events in general, albeit from a macroeconomic and development economic standpoint, which I think is useful for those in the sports and events community to think about as well. I hope that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ian. I think it's good for us also to hear from someone who's outside of the sport industry who can give us a more neutral perspective. So I think at this point, let me just hand over to you to begin your presentation. And there we go.
Great. Thank you, Ming. So I'm here today to talk about the impact of sports events on economic growth and development. Let me begin by doing the same thing as I would do with my students when I introduce the topic of macroeconomics, and pose this question to all of you. How do you measure economic performance? Those viewing on Facebook Live, feel free to put your answers in the comment section. So in other words, feel free to comment on what you think is an indicator that an economy is doing well or doing poorly. What is the rich economy? What do you consider as a successful country, or what you do not consider as a successful country? So while waiting for the comments to stream in, Ming, what do you think?
Goodness, Ian, putting me on the spot. I think it could be measured in job opportunities and productivity.
Yeah, exactly.
And while we are waiting, yeah?
That's perfect. I think that's great.
Super. While we're waiting for more answers to stream in, I'm going to vanish off the screen so that Ian doesn't ask me any more questions.
Great. We have an answer saying GDP already. I think, yeah, the gross domestic product and economy, it's definitely one of the most conventional way of measuring the size of an economy and also the health of an economy. And a lot of people say that it is a good, when you do GDP per capita, for example, is a good indicator of average income of the people. Again, I mean average income, not everyone's income, just the average income of an economy. So perfect. Thank you, Andy. So yeah, so in fact, this is exactly, so what Ming said, what Andy has said is exactly what we look at in the economics classes that I teach. Some of these are what we call the macroeconomic indicators of the economy. So we look at things like economic growth, unemployment rates, inflation levels, current account of the balance of payment, and also national debt. So this is 6 or 7 of the macroeconomic objectives that we actually look at. Therefore, it is of no surprise that in the very conventional way of comparing economies around the world, we always say that we want the economy to have high GDP, low unemployment, low inflation, a favorable current account balance, and a small national debt. Okay, I think I'm getting a little bit too much into teaching an economics course right now. So Ming, if you're still there, please do feel free to stop me from babbling on as and when you see fit, please. What I'll do today is I'll just focus briefly on 3 indicators, which is economic growth and national income, employment and unemployment rates, anything to do with the labor force in terms of that, and also the government's fiscal position or the national debt, which I think it's one of the most one of the headline news that comes out when we talk about sports events or events in general. Okay. But fret not, I'm actually going to talk a little bit on what we mean by development as well. So looking at it from a more societal impact, on the impact of society, not just from a macroeconomic perspective. So hopefully it won't go into too much detail on an economics class, but gets us to think a little bit on actually what is the impact in terms of a very, very specific economic framework, but not too much into the theories and data and things like that. So yeah, so let's start with the first one, economic growth and national income. I'm sure all of you have probably heard about this 3 letters somewhere, GDP, so gross domestic product. Okay. So the simple definition is it is a measurement which calculates the total output of all goods and services produced in the economy at a given time period. So the question that we are trying to look at today is whether sports events can contribute to this. Can sports events actually contribute to the total output? From a theoretical framework, definitely. We can come up with lots of examples, lots of points of reference there. One of the most simplified way of looking at this when we're trying to estimate this GDP value is to look at the national expenditure, which theoretically should correspond with national output and national expenditure. So those of you who are familiar with economics, there is a whole Keynesian models of the circular flow of income, which actually explains how this equation comes about. But I will not get into that today. However, what we'll look at is we'll see what comprises of this national expenditure, which corresponds to this formula here, aggregate demand. And for those who have done economics before, I think that's one of the most important formulas that your teacher has asked you to memorize. So AD equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. I definitely get my students to do that all the time. Probably just repeat it out loud to me as well. Okay, so what is this C, I, G, X, and X and M? So C is the consumer spending. So in terms of events, think about the spending at the events that is being organized and the supporting businesses due to the events that is being organized. So think about the expenditure of spectators on tickets, on foods, on drink, maybe even on the merchandise that they're buying from the event itself. And that's all what we consider C. So consumption, domestic consumption, the consumption of the people on the sports events or whatever events that we're talking about. And then we move on to I. I is the impact on investments. So I is for investments here. So some events are obviously paid for by private investors, which are considered as I. But I think a lot of the events that you might be thinking about today is also about one that is actually sponsored by the government or organized by the government. Okay? But even if it's organized by the government, think about what these events could actually have on private investments. So think about the prestige for the city, which would encourage private investments. So the picture that I put first here, this is actually a sketch of the Eiffel Tower during the World Expo. And imagine what that has done to the image of Paris. And I think it's definitely have increased the image of Paris and increased private investments in Paris as well, increased the investments on tourist activities. So those are all the I. And a more recent example, I guess, Dubai Expo 2020, which has been postponed to 2021. Historically, organizing this World Expo is seen as a very big event. And with Dubai organizing it, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to put Dubai further on the map for international investors, just promote more FDIs coming into that country or that economy. So that's the impact on I. And then we go on to G. G is government spending. So events, as I said before, are usually paid by governments. And when they organize events, they would include spending on building new infrastructure, for example. And a lot of you here probably, they'll be hiring you to actually organize the event, organize the games. Okay. From an economic perspective, this is very consistent with, again, the Keynesian view of government role in stimulating the economy. And there's a famous quote. So just think about this simply. There's a famous quote that actually suggests that the government, according to Keynes, sometimes should just hire someone to dig a hole and then hire another person to cover the hole back again. And this is actually going to be good for the economy. It's actually going to stimulate the economy. So if we're talking about events, isn't it a better way to spend the money on organizing events, building sports venues, than actually just getting someone to dig a hole and fill it back up again? So G definitely has a big role to play in the economy, and also sports events definitely has a big role to play in actually stimulating this government spending in something that could be actually useful for the economy, instead of just digging a hole and putting it back in. Okay. And the final one, X minus M. XM here is exports and imports. I'll just focus on the X here, because one of the things that actually that usually confuses my students is the fact that exports are not just the tangible physical products that you can actually touch, you can actually see, but it's also the exports of services. So things like hotel services, transportation services, recreation services, these are all exports which actually bring in money from abroad. And so this could actually, again, stimulate the economy, increase the amount of total expenditure in the economy in terms of this aggregate demand equation, or in a more general terms, the national expenditure, because money is flowing in from other countries coming into the economy as well. So as seen before, the World Expo is expected to bring in tourists from all over the world. And the money that flows in from abroad is definitely very, very valuable to an economy. And in terms of the Olympics, which I think I'll be focusing a little bit more specifically on today, it is estimated that, considering everything else, whatever happens, there's going to be at least 40,000 extra tourists just from the Olympic family. So things like family members traveling to see their kids, sons and daughters compete, coaches, invited guests, all part of this Olympic family. So 40,000 extra people, just them, will be traveling to an Olympic event. Okay? And this is not even considering the other tourists that maybe may not be connected, but just like to go watch the Olympic event. So those are all going to be really useful. This is all going to be considered as X in an economy. So the exports of an economy, which would again bring money into the economy. And the last one, which is sort of connected to this formula, but some people actually talk less about it, but it is significant, especially according to Keynesians, according to a certain branch of economics, that there's the associated multipliers. So we talk about multiplier in an economy as a concept where when one spending leads to other spending. Okay? So for example, let's say there is an Olympic event going on. So I spend my money buying tickets for this event. This actually creates additional revenue for the organizer. And the organizer, therefore, could maybe hire more people or expand their business for other events. And this, again, would lead to more job opportunities for these people, more income for these people. And then these new employees would spend it on their local pub, or they're going to go to their local restaurants, or in Malaysia, the local mamas, they're going to spend more money there. So this is all coming from just the extra sports events, which could actually multiply into the economy. So the increase in expenditure by one person could actually lead to a more than proportionate increase in the overall expenditure of the economy. So we started off with just sports events or whatever events, and let's say there was an additional 1 million spending there, but the overall income of the economy could grow by more than 1 million just because of this associated multipliers. Okay. So hopefully that sort of gives you, I mean, it's not the simplest concept, but hopefully that I've sort of done it in a very easily understandable way. So we can look at some data here. Just let's look at the left table first. These are the sports-related GDP in EU member states, which is a report by the European Commission. So according to this report, approximately 2.12% of the total EU's GDP actually came from sports-related events. Not just events, but just sports-related activities, basically. Okay. And then I'll quote London 2012 a little bit more than normal in this presentation compared to other events, just because I think it's one of the most scrutinized events in terms of transparency, in terms of government expenditure and things like that. So we do have lots of data to look at when we sort of research the London 2012 games. So we can see from this table that according to the research done, just because of the London 2012 games, there was an additional output of approximately 57 billion pounds to 82 billion pounds. So that's the low and high range in that case. So lots and lots of additional output was generated by the London 2012 games. And we'll get back to this table later when we go on to the next indicator as well. So that's some data to support the points that I was talking about before. And actually, this is quite an interesting headline, but I think this podcast, Business Casual, slightly misquoted the Wall Street Journal here. That they actually said that because Japan has postponed, because the Olympics has been postponed in Japan, there was loss of 1.6% from Japan's GDP growth. Okay, so it's an interesting number. I don't think it's actually fully accurate, but it does give you the extent of what people see as the impact of sports events to an economy. So that's the first one in terms of national income and economic growth. So obviously there is room to argue in economics that there is going to be definitely a rationale to stimulate an economy. We should definitely try to organize events, sports events, big events like the Olympics, the World Expo, Youth Olympics, whatever events that you're thinking about. So there is a macroeconomic impact there. In terms of employment, again, I think this one's more obvious. Even Ming realized it as well. It's about lots of what does sports have on employing people in an economy. So by looking at employment rates, for example, in terms of the share of total employment, we have the EU, again, the same report that I was talking about earlier. They came out with this table. So you can see that the various types of goods and services that is related to sports. So we have things like education services which are related to sports services, retail trade, accommodation, and food services. And I think a lot of you are here, you're part of the sports services probably. So in terms of you as an event organizer, this is actually the employment part of the macroeconomy. So you guys are actually employed, and this is considered in the employment part of measuring the size and the health of an economy in this case. Okay, but in addition to that, there's also, again, construction workers, tourism workers that will all come from sports-related or events-related events. Okay. And in economics, I'll also plug in another concept, one of my favorite concepts in microeconomics, which are externalities. What we have listed here is everything that is connected to sports itself. But what about the ones that are not connected to sports, but it's sort of like helped by the sports events or sports activities in an economy? So the spillover effect of all this employment, all these types of services on other services. Okay, so this is similar to the multiplier effect, but again, this is a microeconomic concept looking at the spillover effects on those which are not related to sports, which I think is also very significant. I think all of this will actually help more services, more jobs being generated as well. And these are what we call the positive externalities in terms of the economic impact of events on employment. So again, the same data, the same source of data. We have a table here looking at sports-related employment in EU member states. So we can see that some countries like Austria and Germany, Austria comes out at 5.63%, is from sports-related activities. And then Germany is also very high. Even the lowest is about 1.22% in Romania. So pretty significant numbers, actually. Okay. and all of this is just from sports-related employment, out of their total employment. Looking at it from the London 2012 games again, in terms of output, we've looked at output, but in terms of job years of employment, for example, the low estimate is the 2012 games have actually created about 617,780 extra job years of employment in the whole of the UK economy. That's the baseline range. But upper range is 893,000 extra hours. And in terms of wages as well, 13 billion extra has been generated because of the games throughout the British economy, the lifetime of the British economy in this case, because of the games. Okay, so that's quite a lot of supporting data. Like I said, all these are from official data. There's lots of supporting data that says that there is a positive impact of events, of major events, of big events. But we'll look at the small events as well after this. Okay. But I guess the one that we can't ignore, and the one that is getting lots of headline attention in the news, is the fact that sports events, especially the big ones like the Olympics, the Commonwealth, the Asian Games, the World Cup, the various championships, is mainly supported by government funding. And this government's funding, people are thinking, okay, is it actually going to be worth it or not? Is it worth spending money on all these major events? So looking at it just from the perspective of the government's fiscal position, what we can say is that, yeah, I think there is definitely going to be an impact on national debt. There's definitely going to be an impact on the government's budget. I do teach a whole module on debt, but we will not get into too much detail again on this. But I think the general idea that we need to think about, the bottom line to remember, is that all governments, with the exception of a few small countries, few tiny island countries, and a few like oil-dependent countries, very few, is less than 10. But besides those small number of countries, all countries in the world have to borrow money to fund their spending. Okay, so all countries around the world, China as well, Saudi Arabia as well, okay, all of these countries actually, all the governments of these countries have to borrow money to fund whatever project that they are doing. So similarly, to fund a major event like the Olympics, like the World Expo, like the Commonwealth Games, like the Asian Games, like the World Cup, okay, definitely the governments have to incur extra borrowing just to fund those games. Okay, so that's in general. But is that okay or not? So let's look at the positive side. It's fine. Sometimes borrowing money is fine. I think a lot of people, for a lot of economists, a lot of governments around the world, it's become nature for them to borrow money already. Okay. In fact, like Japan is actually one of the most indebted countries. Singapore is actually one of the most indebted countries as well. But it's fine. No one's saying that those economies are weak. Okay. But so how can we look at it in terms of, is it going to be good for the government to actually incur additional borrowing for that? So the 3 points that I've raised here is, first, obviously, we've looked at it in terms of economic growth. Sports events definitely would generate economic growth. If you're looking at it from that perspective, that sports events are generating economic growth, if you're borrowing more money, fine. As long as the economic growth that is being generated from that exceeds the amount that the extra that is being spent has generated a level of economic growth that exceeds the extra amount of debt that is being incurred. So with the debt to GDP ratio falling, it's fine. So even though the total amount of debt has increased, if GDP is growing faster because of this extra amount of debt, it's fine. It does reduce the fiscal strain. It does reduce the debt burden there. Okay. So, but that's with the condition that the economic growth generated from these events exceeds the amount of debt that is being incurred there. Okay, so it's not a problem to borrow more money if you can actually generate more economic growth. So that's totally fine. So that's a good point. And we can see that how is it going to generate economic growth? How is it going to be good for the government? There's also going to be additional tax revenues. So I'm sure more companies are getting more profits because of these events. These companies have to pay corporation tax. The money goes to the government. Great, government has extra money. We've looked at the extra employment that is being generated. More people being employed, more people earning money. This means that more people are paying taxes. Great, the government gets more income tax. Sports events, we have more people spending money because of the events. buying tickets, buying food, buying merchandise. When you're taxing these people, there's a tax on consumption. Depending on which country, there's VAT, there's GST. So you have value-added tax, you have goods and services tax. These are all charged on your consumption. So these will all generate extra government revenue as well. Great. So good for the government. So the government's fiscal position here is being advantaged because of these sports events. And revenue from ticket sales, I think that's quite an obvious one. The government will get revenue from ticket sales, and therefore this will be counted as government revenue as well. Okay, so these are all positive side of things. But ask an economist a question, and you'll always get two answers. You'll never get just one answer. So you have a positive side of things there. But there's obviously lots of criticisms. There's undoubtedly downsides to sports events as well. Okay, so big events like the Olympics leads to governments incurring huge debts. Okay, so let's just look at some simple numbers. For the London 2012 games again, the bidding cost about 29.1 million. 20 million came from the government. And the budget, the event budget as a whole was 8.77 billion. Approximately 6 million came from the central governments. About 6 billion, sorry, I think that's a mistake. Approximately 6 billion came from the central government. And then looking at other games as well, they looked at debt from the 1976 Montreal Games not being fully repaid until 2006, actually. That's quite a long time, isn't it? Okay. So these are all the downsides of having too much debt in this case, too much extra spending. Okay. And if we're looking at the London 2012 games again, sorry, I didn't put it there, but ticket sales was only 659 million pounds. Okay. So you had the event budget of 8.77 billion. Ticket sales was only 659 million. Okay. Pretty big difference here. There's a pretty big deficit from this. So where is the government going to get this money from? They're going to borrow money. Okay. So this debt, this is going to be very huge debts. Okay. And then again, I think as I've made a YouTube video on this as well. What is the problem with huge debts? And one of the problems of huge debts, it is actually going to reduce investor confidence. Okay. So this additional debt, which creates lots of fiscal strain to the economy, could actually be a negative point when investors are thinking about whether to invest in that economy or not, whether to put an FDI into that country, because they're actually not super sure whether they will be the financial system will be safe, whether the economy will continue to grow. Okay? Or even if they're trying to lend money to these countries, they're not actually sure whether they're going to be able to pay back. Okay? So all this could lead to a fall in investor confidence, which could lead to negative economic growth, reducing I, reducing AD, reducing the level of economic growth in the economy. Okay, and then we have also other criticisms, like we've talked about some data, we've talked about the extra spending because of events. But some economists also look at what they call the substitution effect. So this substitution effect is the substitution from other recreation spending. So because of these new events that is being organized, because of this big events that is being organized, some people might save money to actually afford going to these events and therefore not spend on other recreational activities. So the effect of this might actually be neutral to the economy. So again, let's take the Olympics. Since people are going to spend on buying the tickets for the Olympic Games, maybe they would reduce their spending on going to the cinema or eating out if there wasn't the Olympics. Okay, so yeah, let's think about when I went to Sochi, for example, for the Games, I knew that it was going to be quite expensive. Okay, the visa cost, the travel cost, it was going to be quite expensive. So I probably actually cut costs on other things. I probably went to the cinema less often. I probably went to play sports less often just because I wanted to save a little bit more money so I have more money to be able to afford going to Russia for the Olympics. So economists look at this as a substitution effect. So is it actually going to have a net positive effect on the economy or not? So that's what we mean by the substitution effect there. I think that's worth considering. And some also say that additional tourists coming in for events is also going to deter people from coming in for other reasons. Okay, so let's take tourism. Tourism went down 5% during the London 2012 Games. That was estimated, 5% decrease. And Beijing Games, 30% decrease, apparently. Okay. In fact, I still remember during the London 2012 Games, watching a news interview with I think a restaurant owner on BBC News in central London. And he actually complained about the decrease in customers during the Games. Okay, it's supposed to attract more people to be able to spend more. All this export of services is supposed to increase. but actually probably decreased because of the Olympics. And actually one of the things that I remember the government did was actually they said they advised people not to travel to central London if it wasn't for the Olympics or if it's not essential. So probably that had an impact on consumption. So this is the substitution effect, the leakage from the economy. Okay, so the leakage from the economy so that's the substitution effect, sorry, and the decrease in tourism. Another criticism is about the leakage and the corruption that could be present. So even though there were additional revenues and additional spending in the economy, how much will actually flow back into the economy? So the multiplier effect, how much of this extra spending are actually going to go into the domestic community, the local community? So if let's say someone is paid extra £10,000, how much of this £10,000 is going to go back to the local domestic economy in terms of consumption? Or are they going to import more goods? Are they going to go on more foreign holidays? So again, the impact to society on the domestic society might not be that great there. Okay, and even worse if there's corruption. Okay, if all those government spending is being spent and maybe it goes to some cronies or to some corrupt officials, and then this money goes to some offshore accounts, how much does this actually gonna help the economy if there was all these corrupt officials in the economy? And the last point here is about the insignificant value. So if we just always compare, I always ask my students to actually compare, okay, like we have those numbers, 6 billion, 10%, 5%, pretty significant, or is it really significant compared to the overall numbers? So 5% on total employment in Austria, is it going to have a significant macroeconomic impact on the economy? 14 billion for an overall lifetime of a British generation of extra wages. Is it really that significant? Okay, so that's one thing that we can think about as well. And I guess the headline on this negative side of the argument is this chart here. It is unsurprising to see that because of the increased scrutiny, the increased information about hosting games, as often emphasized by certain economists, you can see in the 2024 games, only 2 cities finally bid for the games, Los Angeles and Paris. Some say that to avoid the embarrassment of nobody bidding for the 2028 games, the IOC actually managed to convince LA to bid for the 2028 games, while Paris was awarded the 2024 games, while LA bid and was awarded the 2028 games. I'm sure a lot of the audience today actually have lots to say about this more than I do. So I'll leave it to the comments later, maybe. So we can talk about all those numbers and all those macroeconomic data, but the question is, does those numbers and indicators actually tell us anything about the impacts of these events on everyday lives and standards of living of people, which I think it's more relevant to a lot of you here today. So a lot of economists and policymakers, especially the ones that are sort of more inclined to the neoclassical view, the more traditional view of looking at macroeconomy, ignore this human element. They ignore the human element of the macroeconomy on the impact to people, actually. So people are starting to criticize things like GDP, unemployment rates. They're actually saying, like, should we fuss over these numbers? Or should we look at the other concept of the last point here of development instead? And in fact, I think this is where sports events and events in general really, really can make a lasting difference. And I think this is really the true meaning of the word legacy when you're talking about the Olympic legacy, the legacy of this expo, the legacy of different events. So what is the impact left on the community and the people from sports events? So I know I've been talking about like 25 minutes here just on the macroeconomic indicators, the traditional macroeconomic indicators, which is still used by a lot of people. But what is actually the impact to the people, the society, and the individuals in society? And I think that is the word, this word comes into play very often, the word development. Okay, so looking at it from this concept on what development is, not just economic growth, I really, really think that sports events can indeed make a difference. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll get you guys to think about this word now. If you hear the word development, what do we actually mean? I'm not going to ask Ming. I'm just going to let you guys comment in the Facebook chat. So if you're convinced that economic growth is development, please do say so. But if you're not, if you think that development is about something else, please do say so as well. And do join in the conversation by commenting in the Facebook chat. So what I mean by development, so my perspective of development, we have things like income, which we've talked about before. I think that's true. We have things like public infrastructure. How does it impact public infrastructure and mobility, and how would it benefit the community? Gender equality, human rights. How does sports events actually promote gender equality and human rights? And a lot of my examples are going to be from earlier were from the Olympics, but we are definitely not just specifically talking about the Olympics. The same framework could actually apply to other events, such as esports championships, youth games, world skill challenges, or even smaller grassroots events, even maybe music festivals, actually. Actually, that reminds me, talking about esports, I actually just did a slight digression here. In a research that I did for a different purpose, I was doing some research on Malta. Yeah, that Malta, that island in the middle of the Mediterranean. Okay. I was actually supposed to visit it as well, but I had to cancel it because of COVID. So that's a different story. Anyway, so Malta, they're actually trying to develop their esports industry. And from the research that I've conducted, just about with the government reports and things like that, it's pretty clear to me that it's actually, they want to develop the esports industry not just for growth and employment purposes, but actually they specifically stated they wanted to leave a more lasting legacy on the Maltese society to create a more sustainable Maltese economy and community. And even part of this, they were encouraging the participation of more females in esports, which is normally a male-dominated domain. So they're actually doing quite a bit just to promote esports and to create a more lasting developmental impact on the Maltese economy and society. So they're bringing in international experts, developing various infrastructure. And yeah, so they're actually doing quite a lot to do this, and hopefully it's successful, and hopefully it does leave a lasting impact on the economic development and development as a whole in Malta. But okay, let's like I was going to introduce a framework, so let's look at a framework here. So how are we actually going to put development into a framework? Okay, economic growth, things like economic growth, unemployment, inflation. We didn't talk about that, but let's say the normal stuff that we talked about government budget, fiscal deficit. These were all pretty easily measurable. I could give you data for that. Whether we trust the data, that's a different point, but it's very easy to measure. Okay, but some of the things like like Ilva actually stated there's improvement in various areas, programs that impact the community. How are we actually going to measure this? So how are we going to make sense of how are we going to actually tell people that this is what we're going to do, this is the objective, this is the target that we're trying to do? Okay, so economists, okay, I guess that's why we have economists. We're trying to make sense of this complex world that we live in, whether you guys are convinced of it or not, but hopefully that's the role of economists. We can turn to the UN. Actually, we can turn to the UN Development Program to begin with. So in 1990, the UN already, all the way back in 1990, they started thinking that actually GDP might not be a really good indicator. We probably should look at something else. So they came out, Pakistani economists actually, led by Mahbub ul Haq, in 1990, actually came up with this idea of the Human Development Index. Okay, so Human Development Index looks at not just income. So they do look at income. They look at gross national income, actually, not GDP itself, but they do look at income. But they also look at education and healthcare levels. I'm actually not sure whether some of you noticed earlier in the employment breakdown by the European Commission, the highest subcategory for sports employment was actually education services. So maybe there needs to be a bigger focus on education. There needs to be a bigger focus on healthcare to actually look at the impact to society. Okay, so that's the HDI. And then about 10 years later, after 1990, at the turn of the century, we had the Millennium Development Goals. So there were 8 goals there, with 8 criteria as seen here. Okay. Again, we won't go too much into it. And then 2015, the UN came up with this, the Sustainable Development Goals, or actually what they call the Global Goals. Funny story, actually. I was actually with my students in the General Assembly in the United Nations in New York for Model UN, where they actually they launched their collaboration of the Sustainable Development Goals and Smurfs. I think you heard right. Smurfs, that blue cute little thingies. So there's a collaboration between the UN and Smurfs to promote this SDGs, to actually make more people aware, probably more kids aware of this as well. Okay, but yeah, so that's a travel story, but yeah, so that's about the SDGs. So we'll focus on the SDGs there. There's quite a lot, that's many goals here. And I think all of you here are probably more equipped at mapping how sports events and events in general can contribute to each of these goals. Okay, so while I'll provide some examples here, I already see some good examples here. If you want to contribute to the conversation, what do you think? How can sports and sports events actually help achieve some of these goals? How is it going to map with this SDGs? So please do share it. Feel free to share it. I've seen a lot of things here. I'll get back to some of the comments here after this as well. Okay, but so in terms here, we have the sports events to create jobs. We've talked about that. And I think, who was it? I think Gustavo has already said something that I was going to talk about here with regards to East London. So the creation of sustainable cities and communities. Yeah, so I was going to say, look at East London after 2012. That was an area that was affected by deindustrialization and actually even government neglect, I would say. Okay, so because of the London 2012 Games, now East London is actually quite a vibrant community. I think a lot of you probably just want to visit. You probably want to visit Stratford now because of the development that has been created due to the London 2012 Games. And hopefully there's some Malaysians here as well. And actually probably those who are following the Commonwealth Games, the 1998 Commonwealth Games in Bukit Jalil in Malaysia. So Bukit Jalil was actually a former landfill site. And because of the Commonwealth Games, they've redeveloped the area. And today, go to Bukit Jalil, it's Sri Petaling area, Bukit Jalil area. It's quite a vibrant community. Okay, and this is all because of the 1998 Games. Talking about the 1998 Games, I'm going to promote Malaysia a little bit here. It definitely put Malaysia on the map, didn't it? Because of the Kuala Lumpur 1998 Games, I think definitely Malaysia got more FDI. They got more tourists. But I think now they probably know Malaysia as more than a country which is just below Thailand, above Singapore. I think I had to explain that a couple of times. But hopefully now, because of the Games, that is definitely going to be a thing because of the legacy left by the 98 Commonwealth Games. Okay, so definitely people know Kuala Lumpur. They know the Twin Towers. They know the Commonwealth Games, hopefully. Okay, and yeah, so there's also promotion of human values, of healthy lifestyle choices, things like the Youth Olympics Cultural and Education Program. That definitely can help the promotion of healthy lifestyle choices. Definitely help the promotion of important human values, the promotion of gender equality. Talking about gender equality, this is one of my favorite quotes, I think. If there is this interview that was done by with a sports economist, actually. And they were asking about the gender pay gap in the US, in the sports industry. But I really like the last sentence. He actually said that cultural prejudices die hard. But the striking success of the women's soccer team, this is in the US, is making it difficult for this discrimination to persist. So I think I really like this sentence. It's because it's really deep in both idealism and realism here. That sports actually has the potential to change culture slowly but surely. And I think these are really the true meaning of leaving a legacy of sports events. So just a quick one to answer the question that was posed to me. What are the economic impacts of sports events on the growth and development indicators of an economy? In terms of answering the question posed by answering this question directly, I think the answer is a little bit more nuanced. I really can't give a yes or no answer here. Official data and reports definitely show that it has a positive impact on the economy, on growth, while academic research actually is slightly less optimistic, unfortunately. However, what cannot be denied is the impact of sports as a whole on the human development and micro-development aspect of society in terms of improving education, health, improving various socio-economic development. Ilva said the development in general, of different aspects of life. Okay, so in other words, in really improving the standards of living of people, I think sports events in general definitely has a potential to play here. And the good thing is, even the the IOC has already taken heed of this. With regards to some of the things that we talked about in the more classical economic perspective, they're already looking at changing the candidature procedure, trying to make it more cost-effective, reducing the financial strain. They're also trying to, in addition to that, also attempts to look at the development side of things, improving the standards of living by including non-discrimination of sexual orientation in the Olympic Charter, principles of good governance, ethics. So these are all the things that, yes, there's the classical stuff about looking at money, but there's also other things about good governance, ethics, sexual orientation, discrimination, and those kind of things. So I think this is definitely a really good thing to do. And I'm going to plug this in here. I know I'm related to some of the Igniters, but I'm going to plug this in. I think that it is definitely worth mentioning that Ignites and Igniters have a really, really important, have a really big role and a very important role and a very possible, you're really well equipped to play this role in terms of, this is what I've taken this from your website, organizing great events, which I'm sure you'll already be doing in Malaysia, in Latvia, in Singapore, in Brazil, in Portugal, wherever you guys are, you're already doing this. And also keeping in mind that it's also going to create an evolving legacy, which, like you guys said, could ignite inspiration. And this really reminds me of what Nelson Mandela once said, that sports actually has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It has power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to a language, it speaks to youth in a language that they understand. So I think that Ignites, sports events organizers are definitely well equipped, well positioned to play this role. And as I've actually found this course on one of the free courses on Future Learn, with Sports for Sustainable Development, which I got some of my resources from, and also really tries to map this role of sports events to the sustainable development goals, basically. So hopefully that wasn't too complicated. Hopefully that gave a sort of a nice insight into my life a little bit in terms of teaching economics and the economics world. So I pass it back to you, Ming. Thank you.
Goodness, Ian, thank you very much for that. That was a lot of information. I think we all learned quite a lot here, and thank you for making it so clear and accessible to us. Maybe we can go into some of the questions, perhaps. I think we have a few interesting questions here. Let's see. Ilva posed a question about grassroots events. What about grassroots events? How would you use this framework that you've shared to look at grassroots events?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Ilva. Hopefully the baby's all right. So I think grassroots events, I think you're thinking about things like reaching out to schools, speaking to the youth, like the quote that Nelson Mandela actually said. I think it definitely works perfectly with this framework in terms of grassroots events are actually one of the ones that would probably make the biggest impact on development indicators, on things like the health and society of different communities, health and education of communities. So, for example, I think in Malaysia, there's already the Malaysian Olympism in Action community, which I think one of your founders is part of, which is actually doing this, going to schools, talking to young kids about sports management, about the importance of sports, about importance of healthy living, healthy eating. So all that is definitely more important than just looking at GDP, looking at output, looking at numbers. But I think these are the important things that grassroots events have the capability to do. And I think your Ignites webinars, your Ignite series as well, which is giving people more of an insight on sports world and on actually, look, we can actually be employed in a very sustainable job in something to do with sports. It's not just a recreation anymore. It could be a career, isn't it? So from a perspective in the UK has a project called Boxing Futures, which is actually a project for people in London, the socially disadvantaged youth in London and a few major cities in the UK, to get them into boxing, into actually keeping them off the streets and things like that. So I think definitely in development economics, one of the most common development models is microfinance. But maybe we should introduce grassroots sports as a method of development, as a sort of micro policy that could actually be really impactful to the society as a whole. So I think, yeah, definitely grassroots events really, really important.
That's a very hopeful way of looking at the possibilities of sports on a more, within the country, I think, rather than looking at all of these big events. That's brilliant. I think we have another question here. one that's close to my heart as well. This year is the 10th year anniversary of the inaugural Youth Olympic Games in Singapore. You were there. Have you seen any of these legacy impacts that you've spoken about in Singapore? And maybe can you speak a little bit about this in relation to your sharing in this framework again that you've presented?
Yeah. Actually, Ming, wasn't that the first time we met?
Yes, it was actually.
Yeah. So yeah, you were the one who interviewed me, wasn't it? And then I was assigned as the volunteer with the German team. Yeah, was you, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, that was a really good experience. So anyone on the German team here definitely that's very close to my heart as well. Okay, wait, I digress. So yeah, so I think Singapore 2010. I think it's definitely one of the really successful points in the Youth Olympic movement in terms of really leaving a really good legacy. I think the CEP, the Cultural and Education Program of the YOG 2010, which was real. I think maybe I was a little bit more biased because I was really there to see what's actually happening. But I think for a country like Singapore to organize an international event like this, it was such a publicized event. A small country making such a big impact on the world, on the sports world, actually. It really showed that Singaporeans, they can actually make a difference. And Singapore obviously is a good sponge of knowledge, of talents, of everything. Not just absorbing talents from Malaysia and memorizing essays to write in A-level economics exams. But I think Singapore as a community has really absorbed the Olympic ideals as well. Looking at it from the legacy of 2010, Singapore has now that they have Active Singapore, Active SG. And now even Sports Singapore has Vision 2030. And they're asking the question on how sports can actually serve Singapore in the coming decades. So I think these are all, I think this probably came out from the YOG as well, maybe not directly, but maybe indirectly. But yeah, so these kind of events have really inspired a whole new generation of Singaporeans who will actually promote the Olympic ideals and really bring more development, not just economic growth. Singapore is growing really well, but bringing the developmental aspect to Singaporean society as well. So hopefully like KL Singapore Olympics soon, maybe.
Hey, who knows? That would be wild and wonderful.
Yeah.
Actually, something that I remembered from the Singapore Games, which maybe it's a bit sentimental and maybe it's not exactly related, but immediately after the games, I was out at MacRitchie Reservoir running. And so there's this loop, which is about 11.4K in MacRitchie Reservoir that lots of people run, lots of students go there to train for long distance races. And normally when you're running there, nobody talks to you. Everyone leaves each other alone because we are rather shy people. But right after the games, when I was running there, everyone was saying hello to everyone. It was absolutely insane.
Yeah.
I could not think of any other thing that had happened in Singapore during that time to effect such a change.
Yeah.
But
no,
so exactly. I like to believe that. Sorry?
No, I think that's exactly what this framework should be looking at, isn't it? Looking at the impact to people on not just data, but looking at it how people have changed because of it for the better, for the improvement of the whole society. Yeah,
all the possibilities that there are. No, it's brilliant. Yeah. Okay, another question. Let's see.
Why are there so many questions?
There are tons of questions. Brilliant. We have a question here from Lou. Who should commit to measuring the long-term impacts? Should organizing committees transfer the responsibility to the local government, or in the case of the Olympics, the IOC should conduct their own research to understand the impact of their own product?
Yeah, I think, again, coming from an economic point of view, from a researcher point of view as well, like I said, like the answer to the question was really nuanced because we could actually see different views. Like the governments were really giving very positive views of games, on the really positive impacts of games. But then academic researchers are actually managing to find a lot of like problems with those data to begin with, and also looking at really what is the impact of this. And they're actually saying that the impact might not actually be not be actually that great, while the government is sort of exaggerating the positive impacts. So I think I don't think it should be just transferred to local governments. I think that there should just be more transparency in the different stakeholders, like just trying to measure the different long-term impacts. So governments can do their role, local governments can do it, national governments can do it. Like the EC did that whole big macroeconomic project and finding the impact of sports, the European Commission, sorry. So I think, so maybe even small groups like IGNITE should be measuring their own impact. The government should probably get more information from these groups. But again, I think there should just be more information, because again, if you pass it on to just individual small group impacts, like they're doing their own impact performance measurements, there's going to be things like regulatory capture. There's going to be things like they're exaggerating their own data to make them look better. So to answer that question, I think that everyone should commit to measuring the long-term impacts. I think more academic research has to be put into this as well. Sports economics is a thing as well. I'm not a sports economist, like I said earlier, but it is a thing. Maybe we should be promoting more sports economics to do this kind of things, to actually measure more impact. So there is, from the community perspective, there's definitely a need for academic research on this. But I think the governments also need to take responsibility of it, but also give power to the local grassroots measurements of it. And with all this data, then I think it will be a better way of looking at it, because there's always, again, sorry, I'm an economist, there's always advantages and disadvantages of everything. So Absolutely. It's best to just take everyone's view in, everyone in together. So yeah, IOC should do it as well, but get local sports, the local Olympic committees to do it as well, and then even within the local Olympic committees, get the different groups to do it. So yeah.
That makes sense. And I think maybe a little bit of insight for our audience as well, that the IOC, when they are working with the with the organizing committees, they too bring their experts in various areas to the table, and they give their insights onto the sustainability of the different practices that they're looking at. So for example, I know that in Pyeongchang, some of the experts came along and spoke with the organizing committee on multiple discussions about the sustainability aspect of some of the venues, about not only its impact on the environment, but also how, after the games are over, can they ensure that the community is not losing money and that's impacting and hurting the community, because the community needs to fork out to maintain that. How not to have white elephants. Of course, this is not perfect, because we see the news articles all the time about white elephants, but it's something that is being done, and as you said, can probably be done much better and with more transparency.
Yeah. I mean, so I can speak a bit from a perspective of an academic, as a researcher, as the very idealistic, but yeah, in reality as well. That's why I think the checks and balances is really, really important. I think that's what's needed, like different people putting in, different opinions, different ideas, and really like transparency. Transparency is really good. I think one of the things why the London 2012 Games was actually, I would say, more beneficial than not is because of the transparency.
Yeah.
So while other games might not have been that transparent. So civil society definitely has a big role to play here.
Yeah. Absolutely. 3 more questions, and then I'm going to start wrapping up. One from Gustavo. In the discussion of the feasibility of future games, when a city is still in the candidate status in an economic perspective, how can we measure the game's expected social impacts?
That's the social impacts is definitely going to be very difficult to measure. Like it's data. We really can't really put that much data into social impacts, isn't it? But it is possible. Cost benefit analysis, that's one of the things that we always do in economics as well, just to like figure out what discounted rates and all those. So that there is a method to measure this. It might not be super accurate, but I think, again, going back to the point about who should be doing this research, yes, the government could actually do the research. I'm sure the government will exaggerate the social impact, the impact of this event socially, but get independent views as well, or allow independent views to come out. I think same with the COVID crisis. You have the government point of view in the UK, but we also have things like the Independent Sage Group, which is actually giving independent opinions about what's happening. So again, we're all in a situation where we don't know much about the virus. Possibly we can look at this expected social impact. We really don't know about what the social impact is. But again, with transparency, with different points of views, I think definitely there is a way to measure this a little bit more effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You spoke about COVID, so that will lead into our next question from a watch party.
Yeah.
Do you think that the world can recover economically from the COVID-19 pandemic through its sports industry? And maybe I'd like to throw an additional point on that one. What are the changes from COVID-19? Does that change anything in terms of how we might look at the events or the economic impacts of an event?
Yeah, really good question. Hi, Charanjit. Actually, good to hear from you. Yeah, so let me just give a very general macro perspective first. I think yes, sports and recreation. Actually, just looking at it from the UK perspective, it's one of the last ones to be reopened. Okay? Oh yeah, you bowlers out there, bowling alleys in the UK have still not been allowed to open. So yeah, it is a tough time for sports. But I think it is even more important now to think about the framework that I was talking about, to convince society and governments on the development impacts of sports and sports events. I think only by doing this can sports actually really be the catalyst for growth and development. I think people are still not convinced. People look at sports as just something like a recreational activity. Okay? But there is definitely a social impact. There's definitely a lasting social impact that could be created because of sports. So let's just take one example. I think the EPL, the English Premier League, has already taken this forward with their efforts in the forefront of the Black Lives Matters. Okay? So yeah, they're really showing that sports can actually make a difference to society. And post-COVID, I think it is even more important that sports and sports events have to really, really prove that their impact is vital for development. Some may even have to reinvent the way they do things, and we've looked at a lot of new reinventions already because of COVID. But I think that's definitely very important. And if sports does not actually change in the face of this kind of pandemic, such as upheaval in the world, then they can't survive. But I think there is, if we think about this structure the framework that we've looked at in terms of sports promoting the sustainable development goals, not just looking at as a recreation, not just looking at it from the hard data perspective. Yeah, definitely. Sports can be the catalyst for growth and development. I think now again, sports with a more healthy lifestyle, people looking at health more importantly. I think definitely. I think, but we do need, like, sports do need to change. They need to prove that they do have a social impact.
That's a good point. And I think for those of us working in sport, we understand and there are impact studies, and there are studies on this by promoting sport, by promoting interest in sport. It's tied in very closely with generally the good health of a community, or at least promoting health within a community. And with when people are healthy in a community, we have less lost manpower hours, and so and together with the lost hours at work due to sickness, there's also less stress on medical systems, less demand on medical treatment, which means less use of medical supplies. And we know that medical supplies, or the use of, I guess, in the medical world, the amount of waste generated just because of, for the sake of people's health, using one single-use sterile equipment as well. So I think that's actually a really
I'll plug in. I have a video on that on YouTube, so feel free to go watch it.
You do? That's brilliant. Oh, okay.
It is very economics heavy though. So
yeah. By the way, everyone, Ian has a YouTube channel, and we do we did mention this in our promotions, and I think I'll type in a link as well for everyone to go and check it out if you're interested. I'm sure
it's very economics heavy. Sorry.
Well, you are a teacher for these topics. Well, the last question, I think, from Aisha. Malaysia was also back in the world map for the Beijing Winter Olympics because of the IOC meeting. In this instance, do we know whether Malaysia had actually benefited from hosting this meeting? Now, this is not exactly a sport event itself, but it's related with our sport.
Yeah, it's definitely related. I don't know whether any impact measurement has been made about that, or even if there was any transparent process in the government when they wanted to host that. again, possibly those kind of events might, in terms of the macroeconomic perspective, like the evaluative point I was talking about, it might not have been that significant. Okay, I don't know how many of you actually realized that we actually hosted that meeting. I was one of the volunteers there, but yeah, I'm not sure who else realized there was a meeting there in Malaysia or in any other countries. But I think it probably did. It brought people there. It brought lots of Olympic money into the event. There was definitely a big contingent from China that like really knew where Malaysia was now. They were holding a banner in front of the Twin Towers. It was a big promotion for the Twin Towers as well. It was right at KLCC. So, so to answer your question, Aisha, like I haven't seen any research being done on that, but I think again maybe from the soft power perspective, yes, but from the economic perspective, I think it's a little bit too insignificant to have a macroeconomic impact. But for those who knew about it, who passed through KLCC, who looked at it, possibly, it probably had some benefit, but I don't know how big the benefit was. Okay, but yeah, definitely in terms of knowing about Malaysia and the Twin Towers, I think the Chinese definitely knew about it because they were cheering the decision that was done there. So sorry, Aisha, I don't think I've really answered that question well enough, but. I'll need to research a little bit more on these conferences and the impact of these conferences. I don't think there was even a education program that went with it, did it? So I'm not sure whether there was this. Yeah.
Thank you, Ian. So those are the questions. I'm just going to share your YouTube channel up there, which is very economic heavy. And yes, so thank you very much for sharing with us today and providing us this clear framework that we can use to consider some of the complexities of hosting an event. I think Ian very rightly points out that economics is one piece of the equation, so it's not the only piece of the equation, although it is definitely an essential part of the equation that we need to be incredibly responsible about, and that I think more and more we need to take action and be proactive in learning more about it so that we can actually take action. I'd like to highlight one of Ian's sharings on sustainability and remind us that, of course, sustainability does not only refer to an eco-friendly, climate and environment-aware games, but it extends beyond that to the community and social considerations such as education, questions of poverty, equality, inclusion, healthcare, industry, innovation and infrastructure. Now, for those of us in event organization, we need to be incredibly intentional in considering the impact of our events. How can we mitigate the negative impacts? In the first place, do we even recognize what the negative impacts of our events are? So perhaps you could have working groups on that. We could discuss this. We could, even if it's not an area that maybe you're not in the sustainability team, but you could be interested in it and ask questions and engage. I think that's important for us to do. How can we therefore promote the positive contributions of our event and the things that we are doing? How do we discover the sustainable options economically and in terms of resource consumption and production, or in terms of social contributions? We may find actually that the sustainable options may prove in the long run to actually be linked with benefits such as cost savings. And some of us have already experienced this in some of the work that we've already been doing. For example, something really simple, such as maybe the printing of certificates. We know that there is huge cost in printing certificates and then sending it. And then there is, of course, the carbon footprint of posting things to every nation and territory in the world. Can we do this electronically? And we know that this is already being used in other industries, tickets for concerts and movies and flights. Certificates and qualifications are also being distributed electronically. So these are things that we can start thinking about, maybe little small steps first. Or what about improving on pre-existing venues, refurbishing and revitalizing the current spaces of our communities, rather than looking for and building completely new venues? Ian also addressed the debate of the economic viability of hosting an event, considering the economic climate in this day and age. And he gave us insight into considerations regarding debt and economic growth and some of the intricacies that we do not always see unless we are familiar with the topic or we are interested to go and learn about the topics. I think, again, the onus is upon us to go out and be curious and to learn. Ian also spoke about the other aspects of development, and asked us to also take into consideration the positive impact of sport that extends just beyond the considerations of money. I mentioned this earlier, that those of us working in the Olympic and Paralympic world, we often see articles speaking about white elephant venues from the Olympics and Paralympics. We often see articles criticizing the hosting of events or games because of the purported negative economic impact. I'd like to throw out that in the Youth Olympic Games in Innsbruck and in Lillehammer, we had a profit from the games that actually went back to the community. With Lillehammer, we had 31 million Norwegian kroners in surplus, and 11 million of this went to the Legacy Center, and 20 million of this went to the Ministry of Culture and Sports to be used for youth sports initiatives. So, and let's not even forget the community engagement via the cultural programs and other soft contributions. So, our efforts, however small, especially in this interconnected world of ours, our efforts, however small, can have a positive change further afield. And I hope that this sharing has given you all something to think about as you move forward in your work and in your lives. We often ignore these larger economic considerations as something for someone else to think about. And I'll admit that I was pretty daunted initially when I heard about the topic of this discussion, because it's something that I'm not familiar with, because it's something that seems really scary to me to think about. So we often focus only on our own operations and procedures. However, positive change can be achieved if we not only seek to gain knowledge and about other functional areas, but also the wider picture within which we function. And when we intentionally apply this knowledge, it can be for the betterment of all. So really, thank you again, Ian, for speaking with us, for sharing with us. You can contact Ian. Sorry, what was that? Such a pleasure. You can definitely contact Ian on LinkedIn if you have any other questions, but please don't harass him.
Yeah, and I think, like, the final word maybe, because there was really good answers on the chat on Facebook. I think probably there could be a workshop just to like map this with the igniters or like whoever you guys invite. And I think this really could really actually look into the stuff that I talked about earlier into a more relevant and realistic thing, instead of just me talking about it in a hoity-toity way.
I don't think it was hoity-toity at all. I think you made it very accessible for all of us. As I mentioned, I was terrified initially, but you made it very clear and easy to follow along. So thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. And that was a great idea. I think we need to make a note of that. My co-founders who are listening in, hey. So our next What Is episode is on 13th of August at 1500 hours Swiss time. We will be looking at the mystery and the math of sport entries. It's headaches, it's heartaches, and the magical, logical, Excel-loving, formula-making people who work behind the scenes to make it all happen. So please join us then. And thank you for joining us all today. Ciao, everyone.